Hello. So, to fulfill what I was talking about in the previous entry about a week or 2 weeks ago, thereabouts, I'm going to read now from the text that I referred to then, which was my starting point. Just to backtrack very quickly, I have a talk in June, part of a UCA alumni event, me having done my MA through them a year or two ago. And this is this talk in June is ultimately my means of testing the water as to where I want to progress my own theory and practice, and how, as a practicing artist of any type, I want to package everything down and think more long term about what I'm going to do. Ideally, as I'm always itching to spend more time and resources into doing this kind of thing, but in particularly post MA, now a bit of time has passed since then, and I'm increasingly keen to break the monotony of life, particularly as I know I am circulating around a few common ideas that I believe have a lot more potential, particularly if I can back them up more intellectually, integrate them with more research and on a qualified basis, integration with other relevant subjects, all of this kind of thing, which this talk is the test bed for. So what the text I'm about to read begins to do was, so I typed that up a few weeks ago, haven't been able to read from it until now, clearing the decks of a few other things and generally sorting life out, eliminating as many practical obstacles as possible early in the year. I have written, this is typical to kind of how I've written a few other bits that I've read from before in these talks, and the overall process will work more or less the same as they did through the autumn, only with more progression. So where I think I improved my communication skills and clarity and conciseness and even dictation and things like that in a few areas, I want to continue pushing that all forward. Now, that is sometimes at odds with braces that I had. This one at that moment, which is a bit restrictive, not half as much as the previous one I had in, or indeed some of the really painful ones I had early on in the treatment. But overall, of course, the purpose of this treatment, other than having profound improvements on my breathing, is how I sound aesthetically, and speech, as I will start to kind of speculate around, if that's the term, I don't know. These are things I will be learning, but that's something that I do talk about a little bit in this text as how that's going to integrate into my artwork more, and the body of theory, the context, the methodology, all of that sort of stuff, to actually package it in a certain way and justify it in a reliable, interconnected kind of a way, so that it can grow beyond just me doing something. I'm, as will become very evident, increasingly fanatical about health, at the moment nutrition, but expanding upon that, the means of epigenetics and microbiome. I could reel off things, but that's not the time right now. This is not the time for that. So some of which I reel off in here anyway. I'm going to start reading this. Then I will give a quick summary of anything else relevant that I can think of right now. But this is going to be the first of this phase that I talked about in the last one. That will continue at some pace or another over the next few months and materialize into something a lot more concrete. And it's all obviously being transmitted publicly, open to scrutiny, thoughts, or whatever other feedback there may be, if there is. The means of doing this is valuable either way, given that it's maintaining that process of accountability. And I think also I'm going to notice, as much as anyone else who happens to ever watch this, that from this to the next couple of ones that I do, there will be a significant acceleration of the overall speed of these entries, and less pausing, and just general improved, concise performance and coherence to my delivery. It hasn't been as regular a series of entries over the last month or two, so that's why I'm excusing myself for being slightly slower and clunkier at the moment. So I will begin. Forward. So one note, I touch on a whole bunch of things here. Free-flowing thought. Currently looking into some form of orthodontic-specific speech therapy. Predominantly, this involves ongoing personal practice techniques, but maybe even singing or something along those lines, if it's the kind of thing that's likely to work overall. So at this stage of my orthodontic treatment, it's increasingly essential that I commit to tongue posture and swallowing habits to allow for better breathing and jaw composition. Why is this relevant to the theory? Because speech is going to be a focal point, and vocal, not vocal, although that's a fun little double meaning thing. Vocabulary is not on my side at the moment. So that's going to come up again. But that I please do bear in mind with that, because I'm getting a pronounced lisp again now. Not half as bad as I had for seemingly most of my life before getting this treatment, but this is an adaptive side effect right now. As is the swallowing, which, my God, I can't tell you how hard it is to try and commit to installing those better habits. So what are the relevant and distinctive threads in my practice? Okay, this is it. Where do I think I should take that to generate more ambitious material? How does my own personal experience... just tolerate the grammar. How does my own personal experiences and knowledge culminate effectively in a way providing optimum value in my endeavours, brackets optimum value objectively, which is quite ambitious. It should be noted it is compulsory to keep optimum objective value as a focal point, in that I want, in the midst of any ambiguous creativity, to have a strong link with making a stimulating and altogether positive impression. My initial brainstorms highlight strong themes in health optimization, biohacking, which is a term that will come back at some point soon, mental and physical adaptability, and measuring such matters against corrosive mindsets and their interlinked corrosive behaviours. defying the obstacles of toxic influences, all of which seem to beg the question, what should determine what is right? It seems the distribution of information grows more reductive, unqualified, and embedded in compulsive tribalism. It's likely a virulent symptom of unidentified, undiagnosed personal needs, exploited and indoctrinated by others operating from the same symptoms. Such analogies aren't particularly groundbreaking, but the abstract simplicity of this process that's playing out illustrates, in my mind, the potential accessible simplicity of enabling individuals to progress through this landscape in a similar contagious fashion that might standardize practices that redefine general knowledge and essential life skills, all of which greatly lacks in availability for most people in the shadow of a feeble promise of self-liberation through blind dominance and greed. This all sounds like very agreeable sentiments so far, I've written. Now for the matter of dialing it in practically, thank God for that, I want to draw a focal point on the process of enabling, specifically enabling self-enabling or self-enablement. Find an appropriate way of putting that. I can talk about self-enablement from the context of binary approximations, which was the focal point during my MA, which this is all a natural progression from. I talked about binary approximations as a means of navigation, an internalized process that's exchanged internally. The indilutable directions of I don't know what that was meant to say, I'm sorry. I'm gonna comb through this and be done with it. I'm sure it will materialize in a better fashion next week. Something about the directions of mapping out directions, the left from right, the up from down, and black from white, that layers up in a web of determinable details that form our shared consensual reality, and obviously negotiating that with our own conflicting realities. I already have essays online from my MA that attempt to unpack that train of thought, but it wouldn't be hard for anyone to observe parallels in my visual and audio work with creating something from such a realm of perceivable absolutes, something I could argue attempts to transcend those absolutes, as digital technology can seem to. And in an age dominated by digital technology, it is at very least a mechanism everyone is likely to find familiar with this. So now I want to establish a channel that interlinks that previous groundwork with my fanaticism for health and potential practical outcomes. The binary themes were already subtle progressions from a question of what the internal workings of the mind could teach us, and vice versa, what we can teach them. This was towards the end of my BA in music and visual arts in Brighton, which involved me training in a basic practitioner level in neuro-linguistic programming and hypnosis. Now, the immediate result of said training made for a period where I considered seeking further qualification in that field for work, but also for creative integration. Interestingly, after that practical knowledge subtly progressed me into the line of employed work I still do now, working with students with learning difficulties, which has mechanics of communication embedded in it. The same essential ideas of therapeutic creative integration are bubbling up now, all of that culminating. So this time, while I consider a diploma in naturopathy, footnote to that, that's not that I'm necessarily going to go ahead with that. I realise I'm becoming aware now that it's a very what's the word, divisive subject, controversial one. It appealed in terms of being a nice comprehensive overview of a number of therapeutic subjects that I'm interested in, but we'll put a pin in that anyway. And or some qualified knowledge that complements the range of health subjects I'm now fanatical about. This type of fanaticism has evolved gradually since my BA days. Has experienced a significant surge in its growth over the past few years. Thus, the question of creative integration has never been more significant. Stay with me. I'm talking to myself. Figuratively. So after a touch on a couple more points, I will reel off some keywords for further integration and refinement. One extra note I was keen to make while evaluating this phase was in regards to Dadaism. Will causes me to reflect on my own positive inclinations, particularly the humorous value of silliness when it's executed well. This within the methods of expression occurred a lot during NLP training, neuro-linguistic programming training, and my interests in public speakers, which came from that. Subverting the status quo in language with just enough subtlety to trigger a welcome surprise. Oh yeah, this is kind of interesting. I remember writing this. Of course, when it comes to humour, it's all interesting. Fuck you. Of course, when it comes to humour, people's dispositions change with humour. And one noteworthy thing I notice about a person's different sense of humour is precisely how surprised they're willing to be before eliciting hostile instincts. This, I believe, brackets based on the point only on my own anecdotal rambles, is a matter of structural preference on how nurture and operate with how we nurture and operate with our own maps of the world. The classic saying, the map is not the territory, the menu is not the meal. And yet humour must, it seems, be interconnected with the greatest triumph of creativity, violating these fragile maps in a well-received manner. No wonder it's such a perfect coping mechanism for distress if said maps come pre-violated. So, yeah, in other words, I was quite interested in what I could get out of the idea of why certain people respond to certain types of humour differently, and what bigger picture that is telling, bigger story, if you like, that is telling about how we structure and navigate reality, and how much we need that to be curated, or are willing to embrace disruptions. How agreeable we find the whole sort of metaphysical concept of disruption, maybe. Something, just we'll put a pin in that one. Do I want to make things more funny? Do I even get to make that sort of choice? Not really, because I suspect it's at odds with the more sincere aura evoking of creativity that many of us seem to pursue, as it appears powerful and sexy. The kind of deep, dark, brooding sort of thing that we tend to go for or seek out in art. Maybe, I don't know. There's just thinking. Okay, what I can be clear on is the words approximation and adaptation ringing around my mind. So we have keywords: approximation, adaptation. This could be my perceived yin yang type thing that I want to evoke, like it's some deep rooted universal truth to our shared experience. A process that by its very function needs to be well received and maybe well exchanged. This thing I'm trying to describe resonates at the core of healthy living, the core of effective art, of effective communication and navigation. If you could call it a work ethic, a personal work ethic, it stands against cynicism, or seeks to, maybe, and the self-paralysis of prejudice and fear. But it recognises that how dysfunctional and toxic approach that it recognises how dysfunctional and toxic approximations come about. Now, describing this as a personal work ethic or whatever it is, that's preachy as fuck. That's not what I meant. Again, this is spitballing vague beginnings of ideas to then be interrogated and gone through with a fine-tooth comb to get to the meat. So, how's this for working? How's this for a working question for the next entry? How to bypass hostile reactions and nurture a stronger instinct of adaptation. Kind of a long, convoluted question, but it is still a question. It's a sentence. So we can come back to that. Well, I will anyway. Speech, as with the interest in human imagery, offers a powerful gateway of entry for the observer. And that's another point to keep in mind and integrate, as I somewhat am now. This will call for more practical experiments for integration. This may be the gist of what's in mind with progressing my own practice, but I believe I can formalise this train of thought from this point, closing this entry by listing the keywords, which I seem to be missing now, but we did mention, didn't we, that you have to appreciate it. It's kind of, it's amazing to me, if I can toot my own horn or be smug about it for a second, the amount of shit I've got done recently. Boring, tedious tidying and admin shit and other type life duties. So this is just something I reeled off on a train with some coffee at some point in the already slightly distant past. But it's enough for me to work from for the next one. And I delivered it because that's the point. Just make, deliver, make, deliver, make, deliver. If I do, two are mutually exclusive to move on and then do the next thing, as far as I'm concerned. So, keywords, well, binaries was before, approximations, wasn't it? That was one. The idea of self-enablement fascinates me in the health and nutrition context, particularly at the moment. And there's something about adaptation. There we go. So adaptation and approximation. In fact, let's just, I'm going to hold on to those two words now. Adaptation and approximation, and the method of self-enablement through that, and to share said resources along. I'm somewhat on that note, so I have enrolled on an online course. I may do a couple of those short online courses at the moment in a few subjects to just build up a better body of knowledge before I start thinking about seeking slightly longer, more substantial qualifications in health-related subjects. So I will do that. The one I've just enrolled in is in biohacking, fleshing out more the means of that. I'm reading a fascinating, very very handy practical book at the moment, actually, called The Mood Cure, which is all about identifying particular micronutrient deficiencies one might have based on certain symptoms, and obviously the simple ways of rectifying those, with obviously a healthy diet right off the bat being the first port of call, and all those other things that we're aware of, and then potential a potential program of supplementation. So that interweaves nicely with biohacking, but then that's going to cross over into a whole bunch of other subjects under the same kind of ethos, really, at this point, of self-enablement, self-optimization. Now, that in and of itself, I'm aware, could be taken a few different ways. Some, I think, more appropriately than others, which I can talk about in another entry. But yeah, as I said, I haven't started that course yet. I'm going to do the first, I think it's called semester or whatever they call it, of a 4-week program. I'm going to begin after making this recording. So beyond that, next week there'll be something else to read from. It'll be shorter. It will be more specified on something that I kind of fluttered over in this one, or around, or whatever. Yeah, so that's a good time to close this. And I look forward to making better stuff. Bye.